Our number one quarterback to target in drafts this year should be that. More this week on the couch. We're talking quarterbacks. We got JJ Zachariason here. Question mark round quarterback, because who is the quarterback to target this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's Deshaun Watson, man. I can understand, I've sort of, and this really happened after the Lamar Jackson season, the MVP season, because if you look at the data, the market trends really shifted after that Lamar Jackson season. What happened was everyone was like, holy crap, we really should be getting these mobile quarterbacks, even though we should have been doing that before the Lamar Jackson season. And the market started shifting, and now we've seen this really tight correlation between where quarterbacks are being drafted and how they actually finish, where we didn't see that, back in like 2015, 2018, you could literally throw a dart in the top 18 at quarterback, and any of those players had the equivalent rate of hitting a QB1 type season as the other. But now, people are understandably, valuing Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes super, super high. And so there are like these pockets in your draft at this point, where before it was like, you're either going to go big or go home at the quarterback position. You go with an early round quarterback strategy, you fade the middle rounds, or you just go with a late round quarterback strategy. And for like a decade, the late round quarterback strategy was the optimal way to go, but it's just not that way so much anymore because the market's gotten so much smarter. And I'm saying all of that because, you have that early round pocket where, you have the big three who did great last year. Lamar Jackson's in there, who I think is a great get too. And then you get into these middle rounds where we saw some of these guys hit last year to some degree. Jalen Hurts technically was part of that middle round group last year. And I think the guy this year that's really intriguing from that range in that next pocket is Deshaun Watson, because, last year he comes in, hasn't played football for a year and a half or whatever it was. But the good part about his situation is that he was still seeing a lot of the rushing action that we want from a quarterback, from a fantasy quarterback. He was still getting 6 to 8 carries a game. He was still getting that 3 to 4 points on the ground via yards or touchdowns. And so now you look at this offense, they add Elijah Moore, they add Cedric Tillman in the draft. They have good weapons in that system. They're supposedly going to be more pass heavy this season, which is also very, very key, because more passes not only are good for passing numbers for a quarterback, but they're also good for scrambles and Deshaun Watson escaping the pocket and gaining yards with his legs. So I think Watson overall is just in that sweet spot this year, where he's sort of one of the last guys that's going to be super reliable for you before you get into the later rounds and you can kind of just throw your darts. And I just think that he makes sense where he's going right now.
Yeah, makes sense as a guy to target for sure. Because JJ, one of the things I like to do is look at previous year's ADP and ask, does this make sense? The delta up or down? And Deshaun Watson, what is he right now? Quarterback 8, quarterback 9, something like that. 4 or 5 rounds after Allen and Hurts and Pat Mahomes. Now, in previous years, Watson would have been in that top 5, right, with the Texans. Now, the only reason I suppose it makes sense that he's lower than his baseline ADP is because how atrocious he was last year. But a lot of things should fix that. And you're already pocketing the profit of not taking that quarterback early, because now you're talking about second round, third round for those early quarterbacks, which makes sense from a VDB standpoint. What's up, Joe Bryant? From a VDB standpoint, they should be first rounders, to be honest, because I think two things happen, JJ. The 30-point a game or 28-point a game quarterbacks have emerged, and the 22-point pack is like a 19-point pack. I mean, I know we're approximating here, but the pack is falling off. The pack is less reliable, or at least last year. Some of these guys that you were counting on, Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, and so on. And I've been doing these live streams with Greg Ambrosius and Tom Kesnick with the Football Guys Championship. And Football Guys Championship is 6-point pass touchdowns, which increases the importance of quarterbacks, and it brings the passing quarterbacks a little closer to the running quarterbacks. But what I noticed, JJ, is that there's no way for your league still to punish you, because I think that, like you said, you need to have a plan at quarterback. If it's not a top 3 quarterback, it should be a quarterback that has in his range of outcomes, let's say top 5 or 6. It doesn't have to be top 3, but top 5 or 6. There's a lot of names on that list. That's not a short list. So, you can wait until 2 teams have their backup quarterback, and you're probably still going to end up with like Jared Goff, right? Or Geno Smith or Trey Lance. Trey Lance is not even getting drafted in some drafts. Now, look, I'm not saying that Trey Lance is going to be worth anything this year,
Right?
but it's not difficult at all to picture him as a top 5 fantasy quarterback this year.
Right.
So there's a lot of options. You just need to be swinging for the fences, and I think that's not difficult to do with Deshaun Watson. Now, I know when you and I chatted virtually before this show, you mentioned Geno Smith. Daniel Harms was on last week, one of our new staffers. He gushed about Geno Smith. I know that you're on the positive side of Geno Smith. There's some sneaky upside there. Why would he be the guy if you get sniped on Watson? No, just take Geno.
Yeah, I mean, well, first off, he was great last year. Not even from a real football standpoint, from a completion over expected, those advanced numbers and how he looked there. But he was fine from a fantasy quarterback standpoint. From on a points per game from a points per game perspective. And then this year, what do? They get Zach Charbonnet, they get Jackson Smith and Jigba. I think that they got Sharb because they wanted a pass catching element in that backfield, and he is more of that grinder that Kenneth Walker's the home run hitter. And so realistically, a guy like Charbonnet could help the passing game to some degree. And then obviously Jackson Smith and Jigba will help the passing game to an immense degree. And I've looked at this historically. And this is something that I've been researching a lot for my draft guide, but I'm looking at these market trends and I'm seeing, how do we find these breakout running backs, these breakout wide receivers, and these breakout quarterbacks. And one of the things that's very evident is, shockingly, that these guys typically come from good offenses, right? So the better the offense, the higher likelihood these guys are to exceed their average draft position expectation. And so the question is, how do we find these good offenses, right? It's a lot easier said than done. We can look in hindsight and say, oh, this offense was good, this offense was bad, therefore this guy did well and this guy didn't do well. How do we do that from a projection standpoint? And one of the things that you can really do is look at the market, look at what the market is doing, what the market is telling you. And one of the things that I tested was seeing where personnel on particular teams were drafted, just in terms of like overall pick, right? And seeing how that correlated to touchdowns per game that year. And what I found was, when you had multiple pass catchers, this is tight end and wide receiver, that were being drafted in the top 70 overall, that predicted touchdowns per game in the current season better than previous season touchdowns per game did. And so what that's saying is, a team like Seattle, okay, the market is literally screaming at you that they have these three really, I mean, especially on a place like, underdog in these best ball drafts where the people are going really wide receiver heavy. JSN is a top 70 pick there, right? And so you get these three wide receivers for Seattle that are going in that range. That's good news for the offense in total. And it's really good news for the quarterbacks that get drafted late from those offenses. Typically, they far exceed their expectation. There's a couple other ones. You mentioned Trey Lance. Him or Brock Purdy, you can make the argument, are values right now if you want to throw that dart, because they have three pass catchers in George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, and Brandon Ayuk that are all being drafted early. What does that tell you? It tells you that the offense is probably going to be pretty freaking good. And not only that, they have Christian McCaffrey as a top 5 pick too.
Right.
And so a player like Geno Smith, you have the backbone of what he did last year. I think the only reason he's going where he's going right now is the uncertainty of him being able to keep that up and maintain it year over year. But I think the system, as we saw with, if you want to feel more confident about Geno, look at what happened with Russell Wilson when he left that environment.
Right.
And so, Geno Smith being there with those pass catchers, with those weapons, to me, it seems hard for him to truly, truly fail.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is an awesome thing that you've introduced. And I remember at different times in the fantasy community, this idea will come up, right? It's like, why is this quarterback 16 if we're drafting two of his receivers and his tight end in the top 20 at their position, top wide receiver, top 5 at tight end, or whatever. Mm-hmm. How, it just doesn't add up. And I think it's a good thing you're doing too, because there's a lot to learn from ADP. There's a lot to learn from the hive mind. Don't just mindlessly follow ADP, but know that it's the wisdom of the crowd, right? And absolutely, ADP nails down what our idea of an offense is, or at least the upside of an offense, or the upside of the relative players in the offense. And because of that, like you said, you can see that, hey, if the fantasy community is forecasting this many players in this offense have a chance to be not just fantasy relevant, but difference makers, then that, and in the previous year, we didn't see that, then you should probably trust that that's an ascendant offense. And it's hard to see. And Geno Smith, as Daniel pointed out last week, also contributes as a runner. You don't think of him as a classic running quarterback, but in a Patrick Mahomes kind of way, he contributes as a runner, and I'm continuing to be fascinated. JJ, I would get hung up a lot on new offenses, new offensive coordinators, and we should. Baltimore's a good example. Like just the positive of it not being Greg Roman is probably a pretty big positive. But I'm finding myself focusing more on the people that are listening to the show are going to be filling the sense. Second year offenses where now it's not it's not a foreign language. It's not trying to understand this coach's concepts. Everybody's fluent, and now we can start writing poetry. And I think that could be Seattle with Shane Waldron, especially with that third wide receiver. And Shane Waldron learned a thing or two about 3 wide receiver sets. Now, I know in our chat we talked about Josh Allen. And I think, does Josh Allen, is it really fade the big 3? Or does Josh Allen really stand out like, hey, I understand if you take Jalen Hurts or Patrick Mahomes, but if you are going to take one of the big 3, it should not be Josh Allen.
So I think it's a little bit of both. So, you mentioned earlier about how we've seen this sort of resurgence, if you will, with early round quarterbacks, and how VBD would say, hey, maybe you could even take these guys in the first round, which is not wrong from a projection standpoint. Like, my projections obviously love those 3 guys. But what's really, really interesting is, I wrote the late round quarterback ebook in 2012 is when that launched. And that was on the back of a 2011 season where we saw some pretty big separation from the high-end quarterbacks. You had Cam Newton had his crazy, I think it was his rookie year that year. Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, Tom Brady, and Matthew Stafford. They all had really good seasons. And really, it's almost an identical sort of, if you overlay last year, 2022 to 2011, it's very, very similar, where you had this pocket of elite production. The middle QB1s, the lower end QB1s all underperformed, and that made them look even better, the higher end quarterbacks. Right. And then there weren't many late round quarterbacks that totally emerged and were able to, be these high end starters for you. And so if you look at ADP, historical ADP, the top 3 average draft positions from any quarterback since 2011 came in 2012. It came after that 2011 season where those guys really separated themselves. It's no surprise that we're seeing these 3 quarterbacks really separate themselves in terms of ADP this season, because this is the way that the market generally reacts. And again, I think the difference between what happened from 2011 to 2012 and what's happening in 2022 to 2023 is rushing, right? The early round quarterbacks in 2012 were Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers, and Tom Brady. They're not getting you a lot of points with their legs. Old Aaron Rodgers kind of did. He was kind of like the Patrick Mahomes, what you were talking about before. But Drew Brees and Tom Brady were not giving you points via their legs. And what's stickier year over year in terms of production is that rushing quarterback stuff. I always ask people, I say, hey, if you're looking at rushing fantasy points per game and passing fantasy points per game at the quarterback position, are you going to feel more confident that Jalen Hurts or Kirk Cousins is going to have more rushing production in terms of fantasy points per game this season? Everyone says Jalen Hurts. Now, if you say, are you going to feel more confident that Jalen Hurts or Kirk Cousins are going to have better passing numbers? It could go either way. And you could do that even with like a Justin Fields. Like Justin Fields realistically could have better passing totals just in terms of like touchdowns, etc., than a guy like Kirk Cousins this year. It's not out of the question. Whereas it is out of the question in terms of rushing. It's a stickier component to quarterback scoring. And so the difference between 2023 and 2012 is the fact that these higher end quarterbacks are running the ball, and we know they're going to run the ball. We have a better idea as to who these quarterbacks are going to be. This is all to say, I do think the opportunity cost is still pretty high in getting these guys. I think there's some environments that call for getting these elite quarterbacks. Like if you're in a less competitive league where, waivers are going to be easy and, you are going to be able to snag sleepers, later in drafts, etc. Or if you're in a shallower league that's like 10 teams, I think it's okay because your team needs to be better, right? It needs to be more well-rounded. So getting a Travis Kelce and then getting a Patrick Mahomes to stack with him, what have you, makes a lot more sense in those environments. But if you're in a 14-team league and you pass up on a stud running back where the hit rates in the first 2 rounds for running backs and wide receivers are immensely greater than when you get into round 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., you're missing out on those players and the chance to get those players who at the end of the day have a chance to far exceed their position more than the quarterbacks are far exceeding theirs. And so I do think that we're coming off sort of this anomaly season of high-end quarterback play. And I do think we all need to be cognizant that the middle quarterbacks, these middle QB1s, are going to perform better more than likely than they did last year, which is why I do think a guy like Deshaun Watson makes a lot of sense. But I do understand still, and I know I'm playing both sides a little bit. I do understand the instances of going for some of those elite guys early. Now, to your question of which three am I going for, from a projection standpoint, my numbers just like Mahomes and Hurts better. I think Hurts is the QB1 based on what he did on a points per game basis last year, based on the weapons, based on the situation that he has there. And Josh Allen at least has some ambiguity surrounding him right now because he has the injury that he dealt with last season. We don't know exactly where he's at right now. The Stephon Diggs situation is obviously huge. And I think that you could make the argument pretty easily that from a weapons standpoint, we like Philadelphia and Kansas City a little bit more. Even Kansas City, just because they have they have Travis Kelce, and I think their secondary weapons are a little bit better than what Buffalo has. So I do think there's a little bit more risk with Josh Allen, which is why I called him out in particular. But I do think that we need to be aware that this is a very, very similar situation as what we saw in 2011.
Yeah, I think that it's probably an outlier in terms of that spread, and we'll see that. And there's a lot of promising guys. That's the thing. Now, one other promising quarterback, and this is great because I think this is going to be an unpopular view, and that's where I think we learn the most. So I ask you, JJ, why Trevor Lawrence is maybe someone that we shouldn't be targeting.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that, we have to sort of bucket and archetype these guys in a way where, Trevor Lawrence is not Lamar Jackson, right? Trevor Lawrence's path to being a stud in fantasy football, which if you're drafting these guys, like we're talking about with Deshaun Watson at QB8, QB9, what have you, which is, Trevor Lawrence is around that QB8 range. If you're drafting a guy there, you really need him to finish as like a QB3, QB4 to really be a worthwhile pick. Right. You don't want him to just match expectation. That's not really what you're looking for. And so to me, for Trevor Lawrence, and I think it's possible, like I'm not like totally fading Lawrence. I think that totally fading any of the top 10, top 12 quarterbacks is probably a bad idea. Especially given the stuff that I just talked about with pass catchers being drafted early, because you get Calvin Ridley, Christian Kirk, even Evan Ingram has a decent ADP. So all of that definitely favors Trevor Lawrence, but I'm just worried about the rushing juice for Lawrence versus, some of the other guys you can get around him basically I'm drafting Deshaun Watson over him. Right. And so my fear for Lawrence is that in order for him, I think, to be an elite passer, maybe not like what we saw from the big three last year, but for him to basically get into that next tier, he's going to have a Joe Burrow-like season, right? Like, I think that's the corollary, if you will, for him to really exceed his expectation. That can happen, right? Like, I'm not doubting that as a possibility. What I am doubting is just the predictability of it, the projection of it, etc. So Lawrence to me is like QB 9-ish from a projection standpoint. He gets drafted ahead of that. And so I wanted to throw him out there just because of all of the guys that are being drafted, in that range. He's the one where, you see a spot or two difference, whereas the other guys I think make a lot of sense where they get drafted.
Yeah, I would just put it shorthand this way, JJ. If you're going to take Trevor Lawrence, just wait and take Geno Smith or Jared Goff.
Exactly.
They have very similar profiles, I think.
Exactly.
There is something there with the addition of Calvin Ridley, but I don't think that's going to send this offense to the moon. If you're looking in that range, like you said, I think Deshaun Watson is a more attractive quarterback, usually going around or more after him, at least based on the early underdog ADP. Or if you're willing to take a quarterback a round and a half earlier, you can take Justin Fields, who absolutely has a chance to make that Jalen Hurts type leap. And then, like I said, what's wonderful, and I just want to put this as a strategy punctuation mark, and you're going to have your draft guide coming out soon. By the way, JJ is going to have all of this good stuff for you. But, just early strategy thoughts at quarterback. If you're looking at Daniel Jones, I'm looking at the ADP right now at underdog. Mm-hmm. Daniel Jones, QB 14. Well, there's a running quarterback for you, and an offense that should be improving in year 2 in the offense. Geno Smith, quarterback 15. Aaron Rodgers. Look, Aaron Rodgers can keep your ship from sinking. I don't know that he's going to sail you around the world like
he's more of like the super flex guy,
right? Yeah. Goff at quarterback 17. It would not shock me at all for Goff to finish in the top 6 or 8 quarterbacks. He should finish. And Russell Wilson, if you like the Russell Wilson bounce back, you look at those last couple of games. Even like I said, Jordan Love. Why not Jordan Love? Why not even again for nothing? Trey Lance, or even adding Kyler Murray, and let's see what happens. See if he's someone else who can hold down the fort. There are a lot of options. You just need to be thinking about upside. Though you mentioned, I want to piggyback on something you said and just ask you, because you mentioned that, hey, if you take one of those top 3 quarterbacks, you are foregoing a wide receiver, running back, 1 tight end in there. And let's call it the 3rd round. It's the 3rd round, okay? And I'm not going to include Tony Pollard because that's too easy. Tony Pollard, mark my words, folks. If the fantasy community is rational, which is another question, but mostly it is, Tony Pollard should be a late 1st, early 2nd round pick.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, my projections agree too.
Yeah, that's just too easy. So here's some of the other players. Well, maybe Derrick Henry's too easy, but here's some of the other players going in the same range over at Underdog as the top 3 quarterbacks. T. Higgins, Derrick Henry, Ramondre Stevenson, Josh Jacobs, Mark Andrews, Breece Hall. We got to go a little bit further just to be sure. Calvin Ridley. And by the way, Lamar Jackson is just a few spots. So you have a little bit of a discount from the top 3 upside on Lamar Jackson, but not even a whole round. Deebo Samuel, Amari Cooper, Najee Harris, Keenan Allen. Who stands out as someone to say, like, I know I don't want to take a top 3 quarterback? Because that's where I find myself in the NFL 10 of death that we just did.
Yeah.
I took Mahomes in the 3rd because all the other guys maybe hold my nose if I was going to take them, and Mahomes doesn't. What do you think about the 3rd round alternatives to quarterback?
Yeah, well, what's really interesting too is that the ADP data that I've worked off of historically, which is all pulled from my fantasy league, but the ADP data that I've worked with historically really points to the middle of the 3rd round of a 12-team league as like the inflection point of where these hit rates really start to drop. Ooh. And I think it's very, very glaring in 2023, like very glaring, right? Like I'm cool with getting a Stevenson ahead of the elite guys. I think that his upside is pretty immense if things continue to break the way they've broken for him. Like a Jalen Waddle, T. Higgins type when they're, I'm taking them. Devontae Smith, I think is still, in play there too. But once I get to like the Amari Cooper, DK Metcalf kind of range, I think that's where you can start to consider some of these quarterbacks. Now, I do think the market is going to shift a little bit. And what we've seen historically is, these early drafts, like in this time frame until August. I do, home leagues are separate. Home leagues, you're going to get these guys going in the 1st round pretty frequently. But I do think we're going to see a little bit of a decrease in these quarterback ADPs once like August hits. Mm-hmm. So, I think you're, and we've already seen it to some degree too, like from May till now. We saw the quarterbacks going in the late 2nd. Now they're more in like that mid 3rd range. But yeah, I think that you're right from the perspective of like where you took Patrick Mahomes seems right based on where players were projected to or what those players around him were projected to do. I think the difference is that, and I took Jalen Hurts in the 4th round.
Yeah, thank you for doing that, by the way. Yeah. If he would have still been on the board in my 4th round pick, Yeah.
Well, that's the thing too, that we always have to like keep in mind, and what listeners should keep in mind with their league is that it can really screw you if you hypothetically, Sig, got Patrick Mahomes in the 3rd and then every other team in your league waited on quarterback, and I got Jalen Hurts in the 7th, right? Because now my Jalen Hurts 7th round pick looks a lot better than your Patrick Mahomes 3rd round pick. But as long as it roughly follows ADP, then you're fine. And I think that where you got him is around the spot that it makes sense going after those early round quarterbacks, just given historical hit rates and given what we're seeing from players this year. When you're in strictly the 2nd round, that's where it's tough for me to pull the trigger.
Yeah. Now in the Football Guys Championship, 6-point pass touchdowns, you will see quarterbacks go in the 2nd round. You will even see Patrick Mahomes get into the 1st round sometimes.
Yeah.
And 6-point pass touchdown changed things a little bit. Okay. Fun stuff. Moving on from quarterback. Again, though, I think that you and I meet, if people are going to take away anything from the first 24 minutes of the show, that there are alternatives at quarterback. And if you're on the fence, if you're in that 3rd round and you maybe don't have a favorite of Ramondre Stevenson, still take the one you can stomach, because you're foregoing the opportunity to take advantage of some of these other falling, these quarterbacks ADPs that are too low. Yeah. Unless you're in a Superflex league, hey, play Superflex. It's fun.
Yeah,
it adds more. I hope I'm gonna totally lobby them for next year at the Football Guys Championship that there'll be a Superflex division, a super flex
Yes.
wing, where there's a big high stakes contest for super flex. As you've been doing your prep for your draft guide, just give me who's the first player that pops into your head that you want to call attention to, that you want to say, hey, I've seen how people are drafting, and at least until training camp starts, when everything's still on a lull, this player is just grossly undervalued.
Undervalued. I think one player that is at least interesting, slash I've taken a lot of him, is Jahmyr Gibbs.
Oh yeah.
And the reason I say that is, again, I look at a lot of these like market related trends because I think that we can learn a lot from how people have behaved historically in drafts, right? And when you look at these market related trends, you're looking at historical ADP and sort of what type of players break out in certain pockets of drafts. The reason it's so important and effective is because you're looking at stuff that hasn't happened yet. You're not looking in hindsight. You're looking at how we were projecting things to go. And so that's where, for instance, the running back dead zone, everyone talks about the running back dead zone and how, my research has shown that it's around pick 30, which I just talked about, around pick 30 to pick 72. That pocket of running backs historically has not been that much better than the running backs you can get in like round 7. So the round after that pick 72 range. Now, a lot of people will say, well, look at underdog right now, for instance. The running backs are being pushed down a lot, but the running back dead zone still exists in every single draft, because what's really happening, yes, there's an opportunity cost component to it, but the running back dead zone sort of has these two pillars, these two layers. One of them being the running backs underperform versus expectation. One of them being that wide receivers and other positions generally do pretty well from that area of the draft. And so the opportunity cost becomes higher when you get those running backs who are underperforming because the other positions are overperforming, right? And so if you just kind of remove the opportunity cost side of things and only focus on running backs underperforming, you can just look at positional ADP too, instead of overall ADP, and sort of find your running back dead zone. And what I've found historically is that around the RB12 range, which is conveniently the RB1 range, right, in a 12-team league, after that RB12 gets drafted, that's usually where hit rates start to drop. Is when you get into the RB2s. This is the standard RB2s, which is why anchor RB is such a popular approach, an approach that people should have been taking for a long time, because we've seen these hit rates be pretty consistent through the years. And so if you look at then these sort of RB2s, these RB13 to 24-ish type players, that's really your running back dead zone. All that shifts is where they get drafted in your particular draft and the opportunity cost side of things, right? Because sometimes that RB13, that RB14 might go in round 2. Sometimes they might go in round 4. When they go in round 4, it's a lot easier to draft them because the opportunity cost isn't as high. But when they go in round 2, it's more difficult to do so. Now, with that being said, there are trends to look for in sort of beating the market with those players. And one of them is rookie running backs out of the dead zone absolutely destroy. They are so good. And I think the reason for that, because anytime I find a trend like that, I'm like, why would these numbers suggest what they do? I think the reason for that is because they're rookie running backs. There's a lot of ambiguity, and drafters are typically pretty scared, right? And so they're not saying I'm going to draft this guy in the early rounds, but he's pretty talented because he's talented enough to be a rookie being drafted in like round 4, right? He's the RB16 as a rookie, so clearly he's pretty good. But drafters are scared because there's not a lot of data on that player. But historically, the rookie running backs out of the dead zone have performed just as well as a late round 2 running back. And so last year, 2 guys in the dead zone last year who were rookies, Dameon Pierce and Breece Hall, both of them were great, right? Obviously, Josh Jacobs comes through. That kind of stuff is just going to happen naturally. I'm not saying there's a 100% hit rate here, but Jahmyr Gibbs, he's a pass catcher, which is another huge boon to guys really anywhere, but out of the dead zone. The offense, the things that I was talking about earlier, you want to associate these guys with good offenses. And I think we feel pretty bullish about the Detroit Lions situation.
Yeah.
And then he is that rookie and he's got a good profile. And the other interesting thing to this, I know that I'm ranting a little bit, but when you then shift to the middle rounds, these middle round running backs, one of the trends that I found is that team RB2s who have RB1 teammates in the dead zone, they also break out at a really high rate. So last year, Tony Pollard, perfect example, right? Ezekiel Elliott, dead zone running back, Tony Pollard in the middle rounds. And you ask yourself, why? Well, the reason why is these dead zone running backs are sort of inferior running backs. That's why they're drafted where they're drafted. They're not as good, which means they're easier to overcome on their depth chart, right? And so Tony Pollard last year could overcome Zeke, or the injury occurs, and he can obviously see more upside from that perspective too. And we've seen examples of this in the past. Austin Eckler's breakout season, Melvin Gordon had that holdout to start the year, and then both of them ended up doing really well on a points per game basis. So I think you're actually looking at this Detroit backfield. both Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery are values, I think. Like both of them can work out and be fine. I wouldn't draft them on the same team per se, but if you're drafting a lot of teams, I think Jahmyr Gibbs is a great get. And then David Montgomery checks a lot of the boxes that you want out of the middle rounds too. So don't think that me saying Jahmyr Gibbs is great means that David Montgomery is not great. I actually think both of them are pretty good values this season.
Yeah, this is stuff. Already, it's not even July yet, and I'm sure my listeners are going to get tired of hearing me say the same things. But if what was Jamal Williams worth last year? I don't know, a 3rd round pick, a 4th round pick, right?
Yeah.
I mean, something like that, right?
Yeah.
Well, how's David Montgomery going in the 7th round then? Huh?
Right.
I don't know. I absolutely agree with your take that both running backs can be good picks, or at the very least, you can look at a backfield and have reasons to take both running backs. Seattle, every week, every show I do, Seattle comes up as one where I think both. Now, and that one, and I understand why you're saying, hey, taking Gibbs in the 4th and Montgomery in the 7th, it does maybe cap the upside of your roster, because it's hard for both of them to be big hits. But I think Kenneth Walker in the 5th and Charbonnet in the 10th, now that's enough of a discount for a good backfield and a good offense. Why not take both? And a thing I really want to focus on is what you said about when the number 1 running back's in the dead zone, the number 2 running back are good investments. And I think how I've always thought of that, JJ, is where there's ambiguity, take the cheaper running back.
Yeah.
But with some exceptions, right? Because last year it was Breece Hall and Michael Carter. And until Breece Hall got hurt, it was Breece Hall. But that's the exception, is if it's a rookie. If it's a rookie in the dead zone, we shouldn't automatically apply that. But if it's a player in the dead zone that has fallen to the dead zone because the fantasy community is like, well, we don't really like this guy, but volume is king at running back, and it sure looks like he's going to get some volume, I want to know who the number 2 running back is. And I probably want him on my roster. Rookie running backs, JJ, I don't want to be too one note about my strategy this year. Strategy tips. I'm looking at almost every rookie running back and saying, yes. Bijan Robinson as a late 1st round pick. Yeah, I think so. Jahmyr Gibbs. Yes. Tank Bigsby. Yes. Zach Charbonnet. Yes. Even like Evan Hall late in your draft. Sure. I'm looking at rookie running backs, JJ, and I'm thinking they all look like good picks. And maybe this is just the bounce back. Devin A-Chain, yes, right? I mean, just go on and on. They all look like good investments to me. And last year was a pretty good year for rookie running backs after a couple of years where they just disastrously underperformed expectations. Love the allure of the unknown. And especially with rookie running backs, I think there are some rookie running backs, JJ, that I just don't think the community has digested or processed yet what these guys' roles are going to be, Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that like Zach Charbonnet is a really good example of this where, when you build projections out, and I don't draft strictly on projections. I really just build projections just to have like a general idea of like where things stand for teams and to just have a good grasp on their situations and where upside exists and where it doesn't exist. And when you build out projections, you get this N number, right? So you're working off this fantasy point total. If you can find an N number that aligns with a player's ADP, but that there's upside to that player's situation, Zach Charbonnet being a great example where, Charbonnet, where he gets drafted is pretty similar to where I have his projection, right? But Charbonnet has a lot of upside.
Right.
If he's just better than Kenneth Walker, or if Kenneth Walker gets hurt, right? Jaylen Warren's another example of that, where he might be, he might be better than Najee Harris, and at least on a per touch basis, he's gonna see more work. All of that. I don't want to throw some hot takes on here, but Jaylen Warren, his projection looks pretty identical to where he gets drafted, but the upside is there for him because Najee Harris could get hurt. He might not play a full 16 games. So I think that's a really important piece to this too. And then with the rookies, and I mentioned that with rookies because usually a lot of them are buried, right? Usually a lot of them, it's really funny. I'm doing this research for my draft guide, and it's very, very consistent at every single level of your draft. Rookies, these ambiguous players, these players with question marks based on their history, second year guys, they generally are undervalued by the market, just generally speaking, right? And what's really interesting, when I looked at middle round running backs in particular, and I looked at their previous season numbers, you actually get better breakouts from the running backs in the middle rounds who had lower running back rush shares the previous season. And I think the reason for that is because, again, they're being drafted in the middle rounds for some reason, right?
Right.
There's a reason people are drafting them there, because they're likely talented, etc. And if it's not based on how they performed the previous year, then there's probably an extra boost to that talent profile, to that situation profile, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I do think like the rookies that you're talking about, in the late rounds in particular too, these guys not only outperform expectation, but they also perform a lot better during the second half of the season versus the first half of the season, and that's when the fantasy football playoffs are, and that's when things are most important.
Right.
And it's just funny though, because again, I'm doing all this research, and you don't see people properly valuing rookies until the late rounds, when it just doesn't matter, when they're just throwing darts anyway, right? Like, people are just so scared to take these first year players in the middle rounds and such, like where a Charbonnet goes, but that's usually where you're going to find a lot of hits.
Yeah, I'm remembering a Maya Angelou quote, and she meant something very different. Maya Angelou, truly great American. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time.
Yeah.
And when running backs show us they're mediocre, believe them. And when the fantasy football community is pushing a running back up on speculation, whether they're a rookie or not a rookie, there's probably something there, or there's more likely something there than somebody who showed us they're mediocre all of a sudden not being mediocre. Once a player has affirmatively, this is why I keep mentioning Trey Lance. He has not affirmatively shown, he's not Jack Wilson. Yes, he hasn't affirmatively shown us that he can't play.
Right.
So if
I'm with you. I sent a tweet about that a couple of months ago, where it's not something like you can think that Brock Purdy should be the starter for that team, but don't trash Trey Lance while doing that, because we don't know. We have no idea. It's fine if you want Brock Purdy, if you like Brock Purdy, if Brock Purdy's your guy, that's whatever. But in doing so, you can't definitively say that Trey Lance is dust, because we have no idea if Trey Lance is dust.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I love what you said about projections and ADP. Projections, I'm not doing season-long projections this year. I'll be doing my weekly projections. I did do them last year. I always struggled with projections because it's one data point, and it's so difficult to convey the range of outcomes with one data point. But I think you're right that when you think about an exercise like projections, which is somewhat conservative, right? I mean, we just don't want to lead people astray with projections. Right. You're not projecting the best case scenario. You're probably, if between the best and worst case scenario, you're probably closer to the worst case scenario than the best case scenario, including when you're projecting across an offense. Like, yeah, is it possible that an offense is going to pile up 5,500 passing yards? It's possible, but you don't want to lead people astray. Right. So therefore, when you look at a player's ADP, which reflects the upside and the downside, and their projection is aligned with their ADP, that means the ADP is not quite reflecting the upside. Right. That means that the ADP is being conservative. If the ADP is not supposed to be conservative. The ADP is supposed to be aspirational. And the projection and the ADP matching means there might be something there. So I love it. I love it. Rookie running backs. Absolutely. And we could go on and on about them, right? Like Dwayne McBride,
Chase Brown, even at this
point. Chase Brown. Yeah. It's funny how the ripple went through Paul Daner. I remember tweeting the story out yesterday. Like, yeah, the Mixon thing isn't over yet. That hasn't been decided. It isn't like the Bengals like, yeah, we're all good. We're going to pay him $10 million in cash this year. We'll see. Chase Brown, our Pit Panther, is he Abanaconda?
Yeah, is he Abanikanda?
Yeah. Abanikanda, yeah. There's so many. I mean, there's so many guys that it's not that difficult to imagine from this rookie running back class being difference makers. Sometimes the story is just one line, Alexander Madison gets hurt. That's it. That's all there needs to be to the story, Breece Hall has a setback in his recovery. That's it. So rookie running backs continuing to be a key to winning. Let's go with the flip side. Somebody that, as you've been starting to work up your draft kit, that you're saying, I see that this is where this player is being drafted, but I just don't get it.
Are you looking at the running back position?
Or anywhere, anybody?
I'd say at running back, this is actually, I'll give you a controversial one.
Ooh, love it.
Because this will be fun, because I could see you maybe disagreeing here. Miles Sanders. And the reason I say that is he feels like a player who is, I mean, I shouldn't say feels, because there's obviously analytical thought behind this, but he's a player who obviously he's drafted in an area of the draft that historically you don't see great hit rates, this RB2 range. But then on top of that, we don't have the best pass catching profile historically from him. And we also know that he's going to be led by a team with a rookie quarterback. And I did these studies recently. I revisited them. I did the studies a couple years ago, but I wanted to sort of update them and talk about them more on the impact that mobile quarterbacks have on their teammates and the impact that rookie quarterbacks have on their teammates. And rookie quarterbacks are in particular, mobile quarterbacks. I have a lot of there's a lot more nuance to it. I think rookie quarterbacks is more straightforward. But with rookie quarterbacks, all positions tend to do worse when they have a rookie quarterback, which is not surprising, really. I mean, like you're sitting in a situation where there's inexperience, there's likely fewer pass attempts, and even fewer pass attempts isn't necessarily good for running backs either, because we want the targets because they're more valuable than rush attempts are. And so, versus the market too. I always test these things versus the market and what ADP has done historically, because I think it's important to say, okay, this exists. We know that running backs, wide receivers, tight ends score fewer points with rookie quarterbacks, but does the market reflect that already? Therefore, you wouldn't have to worry about that while you're drafting, right? And it turns out that at the quarterback, or at with these rookie quarterbacks, not so much the mobile quarterbacks, but with these rookie quarterbacks, they do tend to their personnel do tend to underperform expectations. So you have that. You have, I am intrigued by, this is one of those situations where, like, I do think Miles Sanders is the most talented back on that roster. Don't get me wrong. But you do have Deuce Staley there, who has supported committee backfields in the past. You have a situation where, we're talking about guys who are sort of bumped up based on projected volume. And look, I don't think Miles Sanders is bad or anything, but I don't think that he's this like game-changing elite running back that we absolutely need to have on our roster. And so I think with Miles Sanders, I think he can meet expectation. I just worry about how much league winning upside he really has. And that's what I'm looking for in that area of the draft. And I think that you could actually make a very, very similar argument for like James Conner, who, look, I like James Conner, but he has a lot of market related things that are going against him, where the offense is not projected to be very good, which is bad news. He's now past his fifth year. Middle round running backs past their fifth year do not hit at a good rate whatsoever. So he's an older back, bad offense. But again, people are going to boost him up based on that projected volume. But teams like that, it's very easy to say, oh, James Conner is the best running back in that. Teams like that, though, where they're clearly rebuilding, they're clearly going in this like this direction of sort of cleaning house and wiping things clean. Those situations, they can get crazy with every position on their roster. Like they don't need to just force the ball to James Conner because he's the only guy there when he's 28 years old and he's not going to be there for he's only going to be there for the rebuild, And so players like that scare me a little bit, not from the standpoint of like meeting expectation and finishing as RB2s, but I want RB2s that can turn into RB1s in fantasy football.
Right. I think that's a beautiful way to put it. And I think that we look in that range starting, let's start at running back 15 right now. Kenneth Walker, yes, he could be a running back one. Just needs to stay healthy. Even with Jack Charbonnet getting 40% of the backfield. Joe Mixon, there's that contract thing. Aaron Jones, if Jordan Love really leans on him, which is certainly possible considering how young the tight ends and wide receivers are. J.K. Dobbins, I mean,
a lot of iffiness.
Right. But look, right after Miles Sanders, Alexander Madison. Yes. I mean, Alexander Madison has shown more in his limited opportunities than Miles Sanders had. You mentioned Miles Sanders, too, as a guy to be hesitant about. And part of that is, I will say it feels like every time Miles Sanders has had a chance to break out or was on the verge of a breakout, he'll go on a fumbling spree. He'll get dinged up. He'll make a bad decision in the backfield. And like you said, it's a new regime with Frank Reich, Deuce Staley. Now, that's who they brought in. So he has the endorsement of the new regime, but they still have Raheem Blackshear could play a role in the passing game, and Chuba Hubbard. And I still think that I saw an item, and it matches my priors. Of course, I'm going to hold on to it. That there was some talk of Chuba Hubbard going to be the goal line back. The point is, Miles Sanders is not the automatic option at the goal line.
Right.
He hasn't shown himself to be. Remember last year when there would be 3 running back touchdowns for the Eagles? Gainwell would get one, Scott would get one, Sanders. Yeah. If Sanders just got like half of the running back rushing touchdowns last year, he would have won leagues for us, right?
Right.
So I hear you. And even as we go down that list, you mentioned James Conner. I mean, David Montgomery's in the same range as James Conner. That's even Cam Akers. I'll easily take like a Cam Akers over a James Conner. And I think you're right, just basically to say like there's certain offenses. This is always one of the first parts of my draft prep. There's certain offenses you just draw a line to the offense. You just say, no, I don't think so. this offense, nothing good's going to happen here. Nothing can grow out of this soil. So yeah, I think that Miles Sanders is a good running back to target. And I think focusing on that idea about rookie quarterbacks, not just that they don't elevate an offense, but that the fantasy community doesn't correctly reflect that in ADP. That's, like you said, against the market. If the market absorbs these things, like this year, the market absorbed, hey, those top 3 quarterbacks do give you a pretty discrete advantage, but maybe that means you're going to go the opposite direction, right? Whenever everybody the light bulb has gone on, maybe the light bulb hasn't quite gone on yet about rookie quarterbacks. I guess before we go off the rails, that's always the most fun part. We could accelerate going off the rails, but we've got a couple more minutes of good red meat fantasy football talk. Tell me something, JJ, that over the last month or so, because this is you have the smarter than thou fantasy analyst. I just ignore everything that happens, and I just stick with my priors. I don't pay attention to training camp. I don't pay attention to OTAs. All that stuff is just coaches say whatever. Who cares? Beat writers don't know what they're talking about. Tell me something that has come out of OTAs that caught your attention, at least made you pause and say, I got to monitor this. I got to make sure that I follow up on this because it's going to affect my rankings.
Yeah, I mean, aside from Kayshon Boutte clearly not being an NFL caliber. No, so here's something that I sent an email blast out to my subscribers today. And it's all free, the newsletter and stuff. You can find it on lateround.com. But I sent a newsletter blast out because our buddy Ben Gretsch, know Ben Gretsch,
yards per Gretsch,
does awesome work. He has a Substack, and in his Substack he wrote a piece on RPOs and how RPOs, his thesis and his idea here is that when you have a run pass option, when they do end up throwing the ball, it's usually to a designed receiver because they have to get rid of the ball quicker than if you're going through your typical progressions as a quarterback, right? And so I was really interested in that because I did that mobile quarterback study where the mobile quarterback studies said, hey, these quarterbacks that are mobile are, team wide receivers with mobile quarterbacks. They've ranked on average as the 20th best wide receivers across team wide receivers. So obviously 16.5 would be the average because there's 32 teams in the league. These wide receivers are far below average. But then whenever I look at what the market does, the market seems to account for this to some degree. And I was wondering why would that be the case? Is, rookie quarterbacks, they don't account for it, but mobile quarterbacks, they do. And in this piece that I emailed out today, I think it might have to do with RPOs, because with an RPO, they're typically over the last 4 years or so where things have really, juiced up with them. They're typically being done and being run by teams that have mobile quarterbacks. Right. And so if Gretsch's hypothesis was correct, that they're then funneling their targets essentially to very specific players every time that they run this RPO, right? And they throw the ball instead of running the ball. They're hyper targeting these players. Then that means that their target shares are really high, and that can sort of combat the low volume that you're seeing from these mobile quarterback offenses, right? And so think about Philadelphia last year, right? Philadelphia, the top team or one of the top teams in RPO rate, and in terms of their pass attempts that came from RPOs divided by their total pass attempts, and look at their target shares to their receivers. I mean, they had 2 wide receivers that are seeing 25% plus target shares. You look at Atlanta last year; they ran RPOs at a really high rate. Drake London, Kyle Pitts, they both had very, very high target shares in their offense. You look at Baltimore historically with Greg Roman. Historically, Baltimore has had Mark Andrews seeing really, really high target shares. Marquise Brown had really, really high target shares when he was there. And so I started researching this more, and I found, thanks to Ben's initial look into this, I found that teams that run RPOs at a high rate that have mobile quarterbacks are actually hyper targeting these wide receivers on their team. And so as a result of that, a month ago, I was not into really drafting like Michael Pittman or DJ Moore, right? Because I was worried about, their projections are not looking amazing. But, when you think of it from the perspective of a target share ceiling, players in those environments that have mobile quarterbacks, they need to have crazy high target shares in order to sort of combat that low volume, right? But I think in these offenses that might run a lot of RPOs, and Shane Steichen going to Indianapolis, obviously they're going to do that a lot with Anthony Richardson. Those guys can combat that. Those guys do have that 26, 27, 28% target share upside. And so I'm leaning more into being, and I drafted DJ Moore in the MFL 10 of death for the record. So I haven't like totally faded him, but I feel more confident in that player, that clear cut top guy. Like DJ Moore is obviously the best pass catcher on that team. Michael Pittman is obviously the best pass catcher on the Colts. And so I'm more worried about the secondary guys on those teams as opposed to the top guy on those teams because of the way these RPOs sort of work themselves out. But yeah, I mean, I sent an email blast. I tweeted it out today if anyone wants to read it.
Yeah.
But, there's really interesting info on it because I love when, we can take these like general football ideas that we see and that we're watching and we're like, wow, why is, there's this quick slant that AJ Brown's running after this RPO and, Jalen Hurts, decides to throw it and he just gets the ball out immediately to AJ Brown. How often is that really impacting fantasy football? It turns out I think it's actually starting to impact fantasy football a good bit.
Yeah, I think that the quarterbacks that play in structure, the stat distribution is going to reflect more the play designs and priority of the team. Mm-hmm. The quarterbacks that play more out of structure, that's where chemistry becomes important. Aaron Rodgers and so on. Yep. And I think that you're right to put the spotlight on Michael Pittman and DJ Moore. DJ Moore is really interesting. You can make DJ Moore. I was saying we were previewing the Bears the other day, and I said, if DJ Moore's a failure for fantasy, you should have seen it coming. And if he's a breakout player, you should have seen it coming.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we got just a couple minutes. First, I'll lead into it this way. I'm going to say, just a moment, rest in peace. 2006, the first Super Bowl champion for the Steelers that we really got to enjoy.
Yeah.
One of the key members of that team, Clark Haggans, passed away this week. And too many football players dying too young. I mentioned Marion Barber on a show earlier this week. Too many football players dying too young. I'd love to see the league do something for players after football. Anyway, but it brings up that we're Yinzers. It took me that long. This is the longest. We've done a lot of shows together, JJ. Yeah, I think it took this long for me to say Yinzer. Let me ask you as a fellow Yinzer, what are the quintessential qualities of a Yinzer? Or you think about Yinzers and the rest of the American population. What makes a Yinzer a Yinzer?
Probably a lack of filter is one. Maybe, but I think the difference though, because like obviously Northeast, Boston, New York, like definitely lack of filter. But the difference is it's a lot more unassuming. Like, you just don't expect it to happen because it's a Midwestern town, right? So when you're in Pittsburgh, it has the Midwestern vibes. Like you feel like you're in a Midwestern town, and people are friendly. But then there's also this element of them just telling you how it is and it being sort of that environment. I think that's one that's pretty quintessential Pittsburgh. Obviously like the accent always brings me back because I haven't lived in Pittsburgh now since 2010. Mm-hmm. And I miss it. I'm going back there in August for about a week for my sister-in-law's wedding. So I'm pretty excited about that. But you miss like just walking around. I'm in Charlotte now, so we'll get random Southern accents and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And you're in Louisiana, you get those Southern accents too. It's just there's nothing that compares to Pittsburghese, to a Yinzer accent. There's just nothing.
It's true. I saw a couple of Pittsburghers, a couple of Yinzers. We were walking to Jazz Fest from our place, and they were just a group of Yinzers, and I always describe it as like talking like you have a mouthful of chewing gum. Yeah. You just slur everything together. There's no gaps or pauses between words, and it's great. But in New Orleans, there also is absolutely, the New Orleans accent. I think Tom Robbins, the writer, might have chronicled this. The New Orleans accent and the Brooklyn accent are actually very, very similar. I think it might have something.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, and remember, New Orleans isn't really part of the South. New Orleans is part of the Caribbean. Yeah, and it's just attached kind of to the United States by like some highways. That's it. It really is an island. But you're right. The accent, and it's not just the accent. It's the way, the words. Because what? One of the things they say down here in New Orleans is your mom and them, which is very close to Pittsburghese.
That is.
It's very, very close to Pittsburghese. And Pittsburghese, you drop syllables for no particular reason, like is and that. What happened to the TH? Who cares? You understood what I meant, right? So it's fun, but the no filter thing is, I think the no filter thing works among friends and acquaintances. It's just among family members where it can become a problem.
Yes. Yes.
And like you said, look, I don't want to make any enemies out of folks on the Eastern Seaboard. I spent a lot of time with folks. I spent a lot of time on the Eastern Seaboard. I went to Syracuse, so there's a lot of people from the Eastern Seaboard. And you're right that there's no filter. The no filter in Pittsburgh still has like a little more of a warm, fuzzy familiarity.
That's right.
Underneath
Yes.
it.
Yeah, it's not quite like Minnesota nice in the way that they would approach like a negative feedback or something like
Right.
that. But it's definitely like it's a good mix of the two for sure.
It's just that I'm not gonna try to, sorry Joe, bullshit you. Like I'm not, I'm just, you're gonna know right off the bat, I'm not gonna bullshit you.
Right.
As opposed to I'm going to be irascible, like all elbows, and that's get out of my way. But I think when I think of Yinzers, I think of familiarity. I mean, people being familiar, where in New Orleans is like this for sure, where you might have a 3 or 4 minute conversation with the person that is ringing up your pack of gum at the convenience store that you never know their name, you never see them again. And you have like a moment with them, you know, or even like people that are not just friendly, but like for a second, you feel like they care about you, you know?
Yeah. I mean, to that point too, like you get away from Pittsburgh and Yinzers are everywhere. There's people have connections to Pittsburgh literally I've never seen it. I mean, obviously this is the life that I'm living and experiencing. So like, that's my experience is, I'm from Pittsburgh. So obviously I make that connection more. But it's hilarious. I remember watching a documentary years ago on Pittsburgh, like just it was like 10, 20, like a long time ago.
Yeah.
And Scott Paulson was on it. Scott Paulson,
the radio. DB.
Yeah. Radio.
Stanley P. Kachowski.
And he was saying that he was in Paris once. And there's a clip on YouTube of this. And he's sitting there and he goes, I'm in Paris. I'm looking at the Eiffel Tower. It's beautiful. I'm experiencing it for the first time. Then all of a sudden I hear, hey, Scott Paulson, what are you doing in Paris? Like that is Pittsburgh, like to a T. You just find like I went to South Korea. My friend was teaching English there in like the early 2010s. And my wife and I went and visited him for 10 days and got to experience Seoul and stuff. It was the greatest trip ever. And we went to a shrine and I brought my terrible towel with me because I wanted to have my get pictures of the terrible towel in these random South Korean places. And we're sitting there and I'm in this shrine. We're getting a picture of the terrible towel. This woman walks up to me and she's like, hey, are you from Pittsburgh? I'm from Pittsburgh too. She literally grew up like 5 miles from where I grew up.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just crazy.
When you run into another Yinzer, it isn't just a kinship of growing up in Western Pennsylvania. You probably know at least somebody in common, if not are related. You may find out that you're related.
Right.
And I always thought that was also typified in, you can find a Pittsburgh Steelers bar just about everywhere in the world. Yeah. I mean, you could be in Saudi Arabia and you're going to find a Pittsburgh Steelers bar. And that's the thing that binds. By the way, the Cubs. See, there's a Freudian slip for you. They're clubbing the Steelers. The Pirates are the baby seal, and the Cubs are clubbing them. Sorry for that gruesome image, but that's just how it is to be a Pirates fan. Okay.
Yeah, I'm wearing a Pirates hat right now, and I feel I always feel bad wearing pirate gear at this point because I hate the ownership so much. You just you want to support them, but then you don't want to.
Yeah, well, we could do a whole other show on that. Apparently, the owner was instrumental in Brian Reynolds' contract. But a lot of people down here wear the Pirates hats because, like, Chuck D, I think, really started it. Like, because it's just fashion. Like the Pittsburgh Pirates P is just cool. So I walk up to people here, like, Pirates fan. They're like, no, I just like the hat. Like, okay, well, you're right. It is a cool hat. I've got my Doc Ellis hat that I got down here. Anyway, so yeah, and I think you summed it up well, and it is fun. I think that all of us, there's the Yinzer diaspora. I'm not sure if I'm putting the accent on the right syllable there, where we are all spread out. I remember when I was growing up, it was just on a downturn, and I thought, this isn't necessarily a place I want to spend my life. It's changed, and of course now people from Pittsburgh are saying, please don't tell people it's changed.
Yeah,
we don't want it to change anymore. So let's keep this a cool place. And it is a cool place because cool people like JJ Zachariason come from there. And you're going to find everything you need. Draft kits coming out, draft guide. And it's going to be that time. JJ's going to guide you. We're going to guide you. Again, Football Guys Championship is underway. $350 entry for $350,000. 2 flexes, no kickers. 6-point pass touchdowns. And trust me, if you get in there, you get one of those drafts, you're going to like the players you can get. At those early depressed ADPs, we're going to do our best to bring those up because we love you, because you're so classy.